certain fees that buyer pays and certain fees that seller pays, and they're not necessarily 50-50. So I just think it's clear. Either way, there's neither one of those is right or wrong. It's fine. Escrow or shall be. Escrow options, of course. Please, think about your in-house services. We've got 3 escrow companies out there, and the officers are all experienced, and they're really good. So there's no reason not to use them. Oh, look, I got ahead of myself here. Hold on, let me back up. So escrow options, and I will say this, I know I'm doing a commercial here, but the truth is escrow is important. Escrow officers control your transaction. So that control should be in the hands of someone that you trust. I don't like giving escrow away. Sometimes it's hard when you represent the buyer. I understand that. Typically sellers have a little bit more pull. I always ask anyway, and I always try to get my escrow. Especially, if you're dealing with a client, and I like to, sometimes the way I get it is I'll ask the listing agent, where is your escrow company? And if it's really far away, then my argument is, hey, my client has to go in to sign loan papers and all of these things, so can we get an escrow company that's a little closer? And, I try to pitch my people. Escrow is important, and you want to have somebody that on the job that is looking out for your best interest and that is not going to hold you hostage when there's problems. Sometimes that's an issue when you're working with outside companies. C2, title insurance. Usually it's just seller, and they pay for the owner's policy, and of course you can ask for your title insurance company. I've got First American in there. That's one of our preferred here. Gonna get a drink. A drink of water. Okay, paragraph D. All of these items, 1 through 6, they're all seller. County transfer tax, city tax, homeowners association, HOA doc prep, transfer fees, private transfer fees. Some of you may not know what this is. This is typically found in newer home developments. I think it's much more common in South Orange County than anywhere else. Some of the areas in South Orange County, Ladera Ranch, Talega, basically what this is there's a fee every time the property transfers title from one party to another forever. There is a small percentage that goes to the builder, and that's what a private transfer fee is. If you're selling homes in an area that has that, they're called things like lifestyle fees, enhancement fees. The way that you can find out if a property has those fees is by checking the preliminary title report, because the builders are required to record a document if there is a private transfer fee. And on the document, it has to say private transfer fee. So when you're reviewing the preliminary title report, you'll be able to look in there and see if this applies. But again, it's one of those things that I always check the box just in case to determine who's going to do it. Now, sometimes the MLS will say buyer to pay for it, and if that's the case, you can. It's totally negotiable, but the standard is that the seller would pay for it. D6, seller shall pay the cost not to exceed, whatever the number is for home warranty. The way to figure this out is get out a home warranty brochure and add up whatever coverages you need and figure out the amount. I have Crest Hisco here. The reason I have Crest Hisco is because when you use Crest Hisco on your transaction, Crest Hisco is owned by our Errors and Omissions Insurance Company. So when you use them for your transactions, if you are sued, Crest Hisco pays your deductible in full. That's $5,000. So if you used Crest Hisco on this transaction, it closed, and the buyer came back and sued you, they would pay the deductible. And that's why I always use them. The thing about it is it's a 13-month warranty. It's a good company. They also offer your seller $25,000 in E&O coverage. There are other great companies out there. I mean, most of them are really good companies, but the reason this one is better for you is that they pay your deductible if you're sued, and I think that's a pretty big value, especially, again, you don't think much of it until you think you might be sued, and then the idea that you're going to have to put out $5,000 can be really, really stressful. So I like to use them. I use that company all the time because I don't want those problems. And, some of us think, hey, I've never been sued. You don't have to necessarily even do anything wrong to be sued. People like to sue real estate agents because we have insurance. So you always want to protect yourself and protect your client. Okay, then you're going to ask for certain coverages on the home warranty. AC, pool, spa. Always ask for code and permit upgrade. I also always put in this, maximum upgrade. I want the maximum upgrade available. The reason I like that, a lot of these companies cover, they have a little extra upgrade. It might be $60 or something, and oftentimes that little upgrade will cover things that normally wouldn't be covered by the home warranty company. And again, when there's problems after closing, most of the time they relate to things that are breaking or broken. And the more coverage that you can have through home warranty, the better off you are. So really try to get the maximums for your client. I mentioned earlier, with respect to, here I marked on 7, sellers shall pay for buyer's closing costs up to $5,000. You can put it there, you can put it on page 1. Either one is fine. That's just another area that you can put it. It seems to work. Moving on to page 3. So the top section here, number 5, closing and possession. I love that they finally put possession on here. It used to say closing and occupancy, and it confused everyone. Now it says possession. We know what it's all about. Buyer intends or does not intend to occupy. You need to make sure that you pay attention to this. Many of you probably heard us talk about the NODPA. In the current market where we have a lot of short sales, whenever you mark the box does not intend to occupy, you need to think about whether or not you need an NODPA. I don't want to go into a whole lesson about it right now because that's another class, and we'll be doing that soon on webinar as well. But basically what I want you to do is whenever you have an investor buyer and you're writing an offer on a short sale or any property where you know that the client is not making their payments, where the seller's not making their payments, before you finish the offer, please contact your manager and check with them and find out if you can use this regular residential purchase agreement or if you need the NOD purchase agreement, okay? But you only need to be thinking about that if your buyer is not going to occupy the property. But don't allow your client or yourself to do this thing where you go, well, we'll just say they're going to occupy it. If they're not going to occupy it, you need to make sure you use the right contract. So that's just a little tip, and again, I'll have an webinar coming out on that soon too. 5B, seller occupied or vacant property. Possession shall be delivered to buyer. It automatically says 5 p.m. now. We used to have to put in a time. Now it's there. I think 5 p.m. is totally reasonable. A lot of times people will put 10 a.m. Most of the time you don't even get confirmation of closing by 10 a.m. So you want to do something that's reasonable, and it automatically says on the date of close of escrow. You don't need to do anything else unless you want to go ahead and build in possession days ahead of time. When I write offers, I always say on close of escrow. That's how I start it. I really want the seller to be out before my, like on closing, and I don't want to have to deal with possession unless it's absolutely necessary. The standard of practice a lot of times is 2 to 3 days after closing, so sometimes you have to deal with that. If there are going to be possession days, maybe there's 2 days, 3 days, I don't care if there's 1 day, you need to use CAR Form PAA. You attach that form. That form is there to kind of spell out all the questions that the client has about insurance and maintaining the property, and you can even have in there, that they're going to pay a certain amount per day. CAR Form PAA is used for occupancy 30 days or less. Tenant occupied property, automatically by default it says the property shall be vacant at least 5 days prior to closing. Do not close escrow unless the tenants are out. That's all I can tell you. If you close escrow and tenants are still in the property, they become your buyer's problem. So I definitely think you always want it 5 days. Maybe you want to make it more. Maybe you want them out 7 days or 10 days before. You've got to be reasonable about it, but at the same time, you should not close escrow unless the tenants are out, because you don't want the buyer to have to deal with it after the fact. And then there's another section here if the tenant's going to remain in possession, and of course it's covered in the PAA. It doesn't happen too often. Most of the time, if the tenant's going to stay, we're probably using a different contract, which is the residential income purchase agreement. So, number 6, this just talks about all the different statutory disclosures. Statutory meaning they're required by law. The main thing that I want to point out to you about statutory disclosures is this right here. Note to buyer and seller. Waiver of statutory and lead disclosures is prohibited by law. So you may not choose, the buyer and seller can't agree to not do disclosures. You know, sometimes people say, well, can't they agree to waive the TDS? No. If it's required by the civil code, it cannot be waived. Waiving it is against the law. So you have to have the proper disclosures. Talks a little bit about natural hazards. We've talked about that. 7, condominium or planned unit development. Just says by default, seller has 7 days to disclose to the buyer whether the property is in a condo. That disclosure comes in the form of this SSD or the seller property questionnaire, one or the other. So if you're filling out those forms, the disclosure will be done properly. Also says that seller has 3 days after acceptance to request HOA documents. This is generally done by the escrow officer, but what you need to do is stay on top of it. Make sure that sometimes what happens, escrow usually can't order HOA documents until they have signed escrow instructions. And sometimes that takes more than 3 days, and the HOA docs get way behind. You really, really want to stay on top as a listing agent or the buyer's agent of making sure that the HOA docs have been ordered. HOAs by law have 10 days from the date they receive a request to even get the documents out. So you just don't want to let that be something that falls by the wayside and you're giving your client at the last minute. It opens up a lot of possibility for problems. 8, items included and excluded from the purchase price. Please take note, items listed as included or excluded in the MLS, flyers, or marketing materials are not included unless they are specified in the contract. So you can't say, oh, but the MLS said that my client was going to keep the chandelier, you know, as a listing agent. This stuff has to be part of the contract. Under included items, now we have this area for stove, which I love because I actually was involved in a transaction one time with a freestanding stove and the seller took it and there was nothing we could do. Refrigerator, if that's going to be left. I always add this here, window coverings including drapes, valances, rods, and hardware. Window coverings are noted in the paragraph here. It says window coverings. The problem with that is people's interpretation of what window coverings are can be very different. So if your client is really excited about the drapes and the valances and how pretty it looks, if the buyer is, then you need to make sure that you spell it out in this section. It's better to spell it out now than fight about it later. That's why I always put this information in so that everyone's on the same page with their expectations. Items excluded from the sale. It talks about, you know, audio and video components, you know, flat screen TVs. So the flat screen TV that's on the wall, the TV is not included, just the wall mount, okay? So the TV itself is not attached, and so that's not an included item unless you state it separately. So number 9, condition of property. This is what I was talking about. Unless otherwise agreed, the property is sold in its present physical, there's the magic words, as is condition. So every property is sold as is. You don't have to state it separately. It's actually been this way for years, but the contract never said those words, as is. Now it does, so it's there, and you don't have to restate it. One thing I want to warn you about is when someone counters you with the term as is, if your client is still expecting for termite to be done or something else, make sure that you clarify that with another counteroffer. So if I send out my offer and I think termite's going to be done and I receive a counteroffer back that says property sold as is, no repairs, I would counter back again and clarify that termite was going to be done. Don't just take someone's word for it on the phone. Make sure that that's in writing. Otherwise, it can be interpreted that that includes termite repairs. So just be careful when somebody comes back with that in a counteroffer. Make sure you're both on the same page. And I'm a believer in getting anything in writing. I don't think you're ever on the same page unless it's written and everybody's signing it and agreeing on it. It goes on to tell buyers they should have investigations. Property may not be to code, may not have permits. It's okay. I mean, you can sell properties with items that are not to code. You can sell properties that don't have permits. That can be done. The main thing that's required is the